2047 is 50 years from the 1997 handover that you were talking about with Hong Kong. On top of that, 2049 is 100 years from Mao taking power. It feels like at that moment, China could take Taiwan, because it does seem that there's a kind of value for history in China, and they take these dates very seriously. On the other hand, as you have studied, there is some tensions and displeasure and protests, some of the biggest in human history in Hong Kong. And so, like, put all of that together, and so many possible trajectories of human history could happen here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm particularly interested in youth movements. And one of the things about, I think, generation is such an important factor. I mean, people know that generation's important, but somehow sometimes people think that, if you divide people up into economic groups, you divide people up into racial or ethnic class, that somehow is more tangible. But I think with things like the Hong Kong protests, that there was a process of what was seen as mainlandization, of Beijing just moving to make the things that were really distinctive about Hong Kong less distinctive and minimizing the differences. And this process sped up dramatically after the 2019 protests. And there was just, partly with the distraction of COVID and the distraction of the world, there was this imposition of this national security law that basically did away with the differences. And you had some people in the city of an older generation saying, like, why couldn't they have just been more patient? Why did these protests force the hand of the people in power? But I think that age has a lot to do with it, that if there was this kind of gradual erosion, or there was going to be this process of doing away with the things that made Hong Kong really special and that people loved passionately about it, including this sort of freer press, or just freer associational life and things like that. If you were 17 in 2019 and people were saying by 2047 it will all be gone, or maybe it'll even all be gone in 10 years, then you're talking about living most of your life in a Hong Kong that isn't the Hong Kong you really love. Whereas if you were 80, you were like, why not be why can't they be patient? And people in between had all kinds of other things. This is one thing that leads to, often kind of logically, there's a rationality toward younger people being more militant about certain kinds of things. I think we see the same thing with climate change, with climate activism. You're talking about whatever projection is of when things are going to get worse further down. The younger you are, the more of your life is going to live in that scenario, and there's a logic for more of that kind of impatience. There's also a sense of frustration with an older generation not having done enough to sort of resolve issues. These are things with Hong Kong, with climate change, with Thailand, the place that I've been working on lately. One of the slogans in 2020, when there was a push for democracy, was "Let it end with this generation," which again expressed this kind of sense of gradual solutions are fine, but we're carrying more of a burden of what we're going to live with there. That. So with 2019, also the protests, I mean, some of the things that were being chipped away at by Beijing. In 2012, there was an effort to impose mainland-style patriotic education, saying like, well, who cares how civics is taught? But actually, that has a lot to do with the larger kind of political story. And the protesters that year, young people, stood up and actually got the government to blink. The local authorities backed down on that, bringing in mainland-style education. 2014, the protest was to try to get full voting rights for the chief executive. The government didn't blink on that. That was something where they held the line. It was a big, colorful, exciting protest, but in the end, it hit a dead end. 2019, there are even bigger protests, and at first it seems like surprising what the issue was. The issue was an extradition law that would have people potentially who committed crimes in Hong Kong being tried for them if the mainland wanted them on the mainland. Now, they're really different court systems. Hong Kong never had democracy under the British, but it did have a stronger rule of law and more independent courts that sometimes decided things that went the other way than what the government wanted. And the mainland doesn't have that kind of court system. 98, 99% conviction rate. In Hong Kong, if you're put on trial, if you're arrested even before 2020, if you were arrested even under a kind of politically related charge, you were out on bail and giving interviews with the press. On the mainland, that didn't happen. So I think in 2019, having lost the battle over voting, this idea that, okay, we've really got to take a last stand to defend the rule of law and a kind of degree of separation of powers. That doesn't sound like a clearly obvious thing for slogans, but it is something that I think we've realized in this country and in other countries as well, is something that can really be definitive about where things are going politically.
Well, I should also say, I mean, it's more dramatic than it sounds with extradition because it gives power to mainland China to imprison sort of political activists and then try them in a very different way. So it's not just even a different system. It gives another lever, and a powerful one, to punish people that speak against China.
And, I mentioned the Hong Kong booksellers who were spirited over the border, and one of them was still in prison for having published things in Hong Kong that it was supposed to be okay to publish in Hong Kong, but not on the mainland, and yet they ended up, being charged. So, there was a clear sense that if they didn't protest then, would they be able to protest later?
So this was one of maybe the biggest protests in history.
Percentage-wise,
Percentage-wise.
because the reason why I've kind of make that claim, because there were 1 million to 2 million people in the biggest protests, and this is a 7.5 million people. So if you
That's
think about
crazy.
what that means, it's just enormous. I mean, there were some very daring protests around that period, the Hong Kong ones, and the year after that, there were protests in other places, but protests in Belarus, where again, there was a very, it's taking big risks and but if people have a feeling that it's a kind of last moment. So these were giant, and the protests kept growing. And I think they kept growing in part, and this happens why protests grow. It's always hard to figure out. But in the case of Tiananmen and in the case of Hong Kong, 2019, if people feel that the sort of protesters have the moral high ground in one way or another, and what tipped it that way in Hong Kong, I think, was really that the police were using really strong arm methods, and the government was never apologizing or never saying we need to investigate that. And I think what really kept the protests going was they became a referendum on the right to protest itself. And what I think the government hoped, and what Beijing certainly hoped, was that some of the protesters would start doing militant actions, violent actions that would alienate the populace from the protests. And the protesters did do some of those things, but they tended to attack. Violence was often against property. And when there were occasionally violence against people, people within the movement would apologize or try to distance themselves from that. Meanwhile, the government was never apologizing or distancing itself from the police. And that created a dynamic where you had these enormous numbers of people who were previously on the fence about things turning up for these protests and leading to them being giant. Even people, and this was a city that sometimes had the misunderstood reputation, as being one where people didn't care that much about politics. They just focused on living a good life. But there was a sense that they wouldn't have that possibility if you had a police. And the police used to be really highly respected in Hong Kong, but it lost that.
Maybe you can speak to some of the dynamics of this. First of all, you were there in the early days, as I understand. How does a protest of this scale explode as it did? Like, it starts with small groups of students, of the youth. Like, maybe you can speak to, in general, from all the studying of youth protests, how does maybe anger, maybe um, ideological optimism, maybe the desire for revolution and for better times amongst a small group of students? How does that become a movement, and how does that become a gigantic protest?
So protests were one of the things that some of the most impressive books I've been reading and about other places have been emphasizing is that protests are often preceded by other protests that may seem like dead ends, but actually provide people with the kind of skills and scripts and repertoires to then carry out things on a larger scale after that. So you often get we we get captivated by a moment that seems to come out of nowhere, but it often doesn't. The ground has been laid by, it can be by an earlier generation that passes on the stories about it, or it can be just a few years before. And sometimes a new generation will say, look at what they did, that was exciting, but we want to put our mark on things by a generation. So there were these 1986 protests that sort of fizzled out that helped lay the groundwork for the 1989 ones. In Hong Kong, there were the 2012 and 2014 ones that laid the groundwork for 2019. Some of the times it was the same activists out on the streets again, but sometimes it was a younger generation who said, yeah, okay, but that failed. So what can we do differently? And we see this in cases in the US, and we see it around the world, of this kind of the percolating of things that happen, sometimes in conversations that continue, that happen. Um, and sometimes, failures can seem like dead ends, but over a long period of time, we see them as succeeding. And it can seem irrational. It can seem irrational to try to do something after the last 3 times people have tried to do it have failed. But then occasionally, history shows that the 3rd time or the 5th time or the 20th time actually does succeed. There's enough countervailing, In Eastern Europe, you would say, like, in 1956, there was a rising, it was crushed. In 68, there were risings, crushed. Poland, 1981, it's martial law imposed. In 1989, what were East German protesters thinking when they poured out onto the streets? And then it happened. But this time it wasn't. So I think there's a way in which social movements are fundamentally unpredictable. And there are just times when, against all seeming odds, something that seemed like it would be there forever just no longer is.
And that's the case you make for when the odds seem impossible, it's still worthwhile.
It it doesn't mean that it will work. It doesn't mean that it will work, but I think history has enough examples of things that you thought. I mean, this is, and it explains why certain figures are so inspirational for generations of activists that, people read. There's a reason why people talk about Václav Havel. Whereas if Václav Havel had died in 1988, people would have said, "Oh, maybe he was a great writer, but his political project he didn't live to see come." But then he lives to 89 and becomes, against all expectations. So Rebecca Solnit, she's got a new book, "No Straight Road Takes You There: Essays for Uneven Terrain," and she's talking about taking a longer view of some struggles um, that achieve things after the point when people might have imagined that they had run into dead ends. And she's talking about keeping your eye on the gains that happen, even incrementally, and the ways in which the need to take a longer term perspective on some of these things. And I think it's it's a strange thing because there's also often an impatience in movements of people wanting kind of immediate results. But as a historian, looking at situations I've mentioned, sort of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, but Taiwan was a right-wing dictatorship under sort of a version of martial law for decades. And at each stage, it would seem that people struggling to change it um, were on a quixotic, impossible kind of mission, or South Korea was in a similar situation. And then in the late 1980s, you start to have those things unravel. And it's partly because of a kind of steady resistance. It's partly because something in the world changes, but there's often a combination of those things. So I'm interested in that whole. We know that what happened in Hong Kong in the short run didn't work, and I don't see a way in which the national security law is reversed or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that it was a completely impossible effort, even though we know the result in that case was to have this failure.
So the protests are generally worthwhile. I mean, they do give, as I look at the description of the migratory routes ideas take, they do seed ideas in the minds of people, and then they live with those ideas and they share those ideas. They deliberate through those ideas. They might travel to different places of the world, and then those ideas return and rise up again and again and again. There's two parts of the world that I think are fascinating and unpredictable. So one is Iran, which the trajectory that place takes might have a completely transformative effect on the Middle East. And then the other one is China, where the protests, whether it's in Taiwan or Hong Kong, or maybe other influential parts of China, those ideas percolating up and up again might have a completely transformative effect on the world.
So maybe this is another case where the Chinese Communist Party, leaders in the Chinese Communist Party, they do know about history and they care about history. And one history they know is the Chinese Communist Party was almost destroyed in 1927. I mean, it was, if you were taking odds on what are the chances that this ragtag sort of group that's being pursued by Chiang Kai-shek to try to determine it, and yet over time they somehow managed to ride it out and eventually come to power. An awareness of the ways in which the seemingly impossible can happen. It doesn't mean it will. I mean, this is why I think, it's and one of the really kind of tragic or heartrending things is you can have situations in which movements that seem to be pursuing an impossible end result, they achieve that result. And then after another period, the country goes into another really difficult period, or it seems that the successes are being rolled back. And my new Milk Tea Alliance book that I've just written, I dedicate it to two people who've lived through a variety of these things. One is a Burmese activist who was involved in a failed uprising in 1988. He then was in exile who didn't know whether he could ever see his brothers who he loves back in Burma. And then something magical kind of changed. And in the 2010s, it seemed that there was a kind of democratization that turned out to be a false dawn. He was able to go back. And now he's again, when there's been a coup and a crackdown, he's now again cut off. And at one point, I was asking him about how he feels about this when he's still trying to sort of raise awareness globally about what's happening in Myanmar. And he said, I feel helpless, but not hopeless. I think, how does somebody maintain hope in that? And the other person I dedicated to, Miklas Rashti, as a Hungarian friend of mine, who was an activist before '89 and saw this amazing thing happen with communism, Communist Party rule ending. He was part of the process that came, and he was friends with Havel, and Havel's there, and Poland's changing, and all of this exhilarating moment, but ends up being a critic of Orban and following a tightening of control, rolling back of many of the things that were victorious then. But this kind of the no straight road, that actually there's something about it can be disquieting when these unexpected things are blows to where you thought history was going. But history just shows you that history doesn't have a direction. That's not there isn't a straight road.
Yeah, and there's, the idealism of youth can lead to things like the Russian Revolution, and then you get Stalin with Holodomor and the purges and all of that entailed. So a successful protest and a successful revolution might have unintended consequences that far overshadow whatever ideals and dreams you had fighting for the working class, whatever it was in that particular case, that can cause immeasurable suffering. So there is no direction to history. There's just some lessons we pick up along the way, and we hopefully try to help humanity flourish. And we barely know what we're doing, and now we have nuclear weapons.
And some of it is also, though, sometimes the people who I find really admirable, it's not about trying to create totalistic change, but they focus on trying to do what they can for the things they believe in within constrained circumstances. And in Thailand, they've sort of hit a roadblock now again over kind of trying to bring about electoral change. A party that did really well was then disqualified. And some of the activists I know are focusing on local efforts to improve a neighborhood, to keep a neighborhood from suffering from a kind of unthinking gentrification. They're thinking small. They're thinking sometimes about just what can we do to improve the life of people within certain, how can we contribute to the kinds of social groups that might make some kind of incremental improvement to being the kind of world that we want to live in. People do that in all kinds of ways.
What kind of parallels can we draw between Taiwan and Hong Kong? What do you think the people of Taiwan are thinking looking at Hong Kong?
Well, I think the way that things developed in Hong Kong have undermined the kind of trust in any kind of story coming out of Beijing that there's a place within sort of Xi Jinping's version, at least of the People's Republic of China, for a place where people live very different kinds of lives. And I think a lot of people in Taiwan feel they're living a very different kind of life than on the mainland. So in that way, I think Hong Kong was an important example that way. And there were connections there was a Taiwan protest in 2014 before the big protests in Hong Kong by people who were young people who felt the government then was moving too much toward working together with Beijing. So they've been interconnected stories. And I think we sometimes miss how people within a region are looking at what other people in the region are doing and are taking clues from it about sort of how to agitate for the things they care about, what the risks are, what the dangers are. Autocrats within different parts of a region are looking at each other too, as well as globally.